Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast.
Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation, where our experts bring you fresh ideas and new perspectives on how consumers eat, drink, shop, groom and think. I'm your host, Andrew Davidson, based in New York, and today is the last episode of Season 4. Time flies, and it has been quite a year. That's perhaps an understatement. The Collins English Dictionary recently revealed its 2022 word of the year to be permacrisis, a term to describe an extended period of instability and insecurity, especially one resulting from a series of catastrophic events. I think that sums it up quite well. I'm sure many of you, like me, are looking forward to a well-earned break, but how are you feeling? The fast pace of daily life, growing use of technology, and having to move from crisis to crisis are creating fatigue among consumers. So if you are feeling fatigued, you're not alone. In fact, at Mintel, we have identified this as a global consumer trend called hyperfatigue that will manifest itself next year and beyond. In today's episode, we're going to break it down. What is it? How is it impacting consumers? How is it evolving? And where can brands help? Joining me on the pod to discuss the implications of hyperfatigue, I'm delighted to welcome Tom Slide and Namada Savanantha in London and Mike Gallinari in Chicago. Welcome to the pod.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
All right, please introduce yourselves.
Hi, so I'm Tom Slide. I'm category director for the media and technology stream in the UK. And I've been at Mintel for nearly 8 years now.
Hi, I'm Namada. I'm a trends analyst. I'm based in the UK. I cover content for UK and Ireland, and I've been at Mintel for, I think, almost 4 years now.
And I'm Mike. I'm the senior travel and leisure analyst here in the US, and I've been with Mintel for just about 5 years.
Excellent. Well, welcome, everybody. Well, let's start at the beginning. What does it mean when we say we have identified a Mintel global consumer trend?
I think when we kind of go through the process of sort of brainstorming these trends, like we try to find where sort of common themes arise. And this is something that definitely we sort of identified in many different sectors and many different spaces. Fatigue in general just sort of came up in the tech space when we kind of looked at sort of financial fatigue and in other spaces as well when it comes to experiences. But the main focus sort of at first was with tech sort of coming out of the pandemic. We did develop a lot of habits that involved technology, that involved apps. We were already quite reliant on it already, I suppose, before the pandemic, but we just didn't have a choice when restrictions were in place and we couldn't see our loved ones and we couldn't see our friends. You know, we relied on Zoom calls and, using apps to navigate every aspect of our life, a lot of which has sort of, we have carried that forward. And I think sort of when we sort of brainstorming the concept a bit further, we sort of looked at, how this could sort of manifest into financial fatigue, looking at inflation. A lot of us are, budgeting and looking for sort of budget focused deals. And, we're using apps to try and save money. With rising energy bills now, it's a huge concern. How can we use tech to, navigate our way through that? And I think coming out of the pandemic as well, a lot of us there's a lot of pent up demand for lots of different experiences, but there's so much to do out there that a lot of us have that sense of FOMO, like what if we can't do it all? There's so much out there, but so little time to do it in. And sometimes due to financial restrictions, there's very little money to do them. So there's that sense of anxiety and almost restlessness, I suppose, not being able to do everything. It's not in our capacity. But yeah, I guess that's how the trend sort of developed initially.
I mean, it's interesting because we've talked about disconnecting from technology in the past, and you mentioned technology there. But I mean, I look around; it seems everybody's on their phones constantly. I'm always on my phone. So why are we talking about this hyper fatigue trend now? I mean, what's changed? What's really changed?
I think that, as I said, sort of before the pandemic, we did see the benefits of how tech sort of helped us sort of navigate our daily routines, but the pandemic, certainly we did become very sort of dependent on tech. And I think now we use it for absolutely everything. Like I agree with you. Like I feel like I struggle to put down my phone and I feel like I need a break from it. But now there seems to be like an app for absolutely everything. And I think, the way it sort of adheres to our convenience, that's not going to go away. And I think that's one of the reasons why we can't completely disconnect from technology. I think that's not the point of the trend. I think hyperfatigue is not something that we're going through right now. It's definitely something that we want to prevent from happening. And so the focus is on trying to establish a healthier relationship with tech so that we can still use it in the future without getting tired and impatient, and we get to a point where we're, as you said initially, fatigued with tech. We want to make sure that we can still use it in our daily lives.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's drill down. Who specifically then is it impacting? And let's think about different demographics, different behaviours. How's it playing out in different regions, for example?
I'd step in from a technology perspective. Going back, we'd already seen, talking as you did about people avoiding technology even prior to the pandemic, and we saw younger people. Already, we saw this kind of this small group starting to drift away from smartphones. So we saw smartphone ownership start to, amongst the under 35s, start to fall slightly as we went in towards the pandemic. Now, during the pandemic, obviously, suddenly everything had to be done by phone. Everything had to be accessed digitally, and so what we saw was that bump back up again, and everyone had to basically get themselves a phone if they'd sort of drifted away for it. And we had a few people going to sort of what they call dumb phones, which, not smartphones, and to try to get away from tech. Since the end of the pandemic, we've seen that kind of trend return, where you've got this small group of people, particularly under 35, start to drift away again, start to say, actually, I know my limits and I want to switch off. 30% of people think that technology has a negative effect on our mental health. And it's this always being aware, always having notifications going off, always being pinged about stuff, being just sucked into, all kinds of things. So, technology is everywhere, social media, always sucking you in, and a growing number of people kind of being aware and being conscious of wanting to avoid it. And we've seen that drive the demand for things like screen-free entertainment. So podcasts, for example, have become really popular as a way of accessing entertainment without having to still look at a screen the whole time. And this is particularly popular amongst the younger generations because they are so embedded in technology and digital worlds. So actually it's Generation Z who are most likely to say that they're trying to cut down on screen time. So 27% of them say they're actively trying to cut down screen time. 33% of them say they've listened to a podcast, which is more than any other age group. So it's that group who are most exposed to technology that I think are kind of driving this trend, which in some ways is surprising.
Yes. And here in the States, we are observing, particularly among younger adults, a big rise in loneliness. And I think that a lot of the technological adoption and use that happened during the pandemic, it gave rise to things like doom scrolling, and suddenly you see everyone's problems and you have nowhere to go. So you just sort of hang out in your house or your apartment and scroll through and just look at all of these problems, and increasing your anxiety and kind of creating this feedback loop of sort of your own loneliness and isolation. So I think that there's a big mental health component to this idea of hyperfatigue, where it's not just sort of, as the name would imply, like a sort of getting worn out by everything going on in the world, but having it actually affect you and internalizing it. And from there, that's where we'll see a lot of activities and attitudes and reactions to those feelings happen. And I think that, Tom put it nicely about, trying to go away from tech, which is one solution, and not necessary, even though it's not necessarily what the trend is getting at.
But yeah, earlier in the season, we had an episode on TikTok, and actually we discussed that, that what you were talking about a bit there, Mike, about this whole idea of like doom scrolling, and how I certainly with the evolution of TikTok and the launch of things like Instagram Reels, of course, people are getting even more sucked in by the TikTok algorithm, for example. How much is social media then really fueling this trend?
I think just to go off what Mike said there, about sort of affecting sort of using social media and how it affects our mental health, sort of repeatedly sort of scrolling endlessly through reels, as you're saying, through videos, through posts. And I think, I guess, like, we just need to be reminded that tech is functional and it has functional benefits. And I think platforms like TikTok, it's hugely influential, very popular, but it's so easy to go down a rabbit hole and just like follow numerous accounts, and you just end up spending 2 hours scrolling through and you don't even know how you got there. But I think that TikTok has actually introduced quite a few initiatives that have brought communities together. I feel like this year it launched a book club for like avid readers to come together and discuss their ideas about a specific book and share their reviews. I think that was a really interesting initiative, and it's a good way for the platform to kind of steer away from sort of being focused as something that sort of where people are constantly posting, and it being sort of a platform that is being used for like sharing photos, for example, or like sharing videos, or just solely focused on that. But it sort of serves the community and adheres to your interests as well. I think during the pandemic, a lot of people were really focused on sort of home cooking, for example, and that's something that momentum has definitely followed through sort of in the last year. And a lot of people have sort of like been interested in sort of international flavors, for example, and TikTok has really facilitated that interest. I think it's really been a lot of influencers who've been sharing their material on how to make various different dishes, like ramen, for example, and a lot of them have gone viral. So there's another example of how it can be functional, and it's a good knowledge sharing platform as well. And I think that's definitely something that brands should leverage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's a really good point. I think the thing about tech is it's so easy to say, and social media especially, it's so easy to say, it's take a negative view of it, say it's damaging, people get sucked in, and they just, yes, your access, you get into this kind of doom scrolling, as we would call it, and you're seeing all this information going around in the world, and obviously people only put on social media the best bits of their lives, so you see the idealized view of everyone else's life, and it just makes you feel bad about your own, and all those kind of issues which we all know about social media. But at the same time, it's not black and white in that way. There's lots of really good stuff about social media. It helps people to engage and socialize and meet people. The Book Talk is a great example of where people can come together and share ideas about books and review books, and is now a major driver of the book industry because it's just such a good way of people engaging in that space. So there's a real nuance. It's about how these technologies are used, and that's why it comes down to not just reducing how much tech you're using, but actually, you now have to use tech to get around in daily lives, but actually how can you make that better? How can you focus on kind of well-being and making sure that experience of technology isn't damaging to your kind of mental health and everything?
On the brand side, it's about leveraging the utility of social media into activation off of it. So going off of the Book Talk example, we have a report on reading habits among American consumers coming out later this month. And in that, we found that social media is the number one source of discovery for finding new books or other reading materials. From what I've seen in other industries, usually personal recommendations take that top slot. But here it's net of all social media. And of course, TikTok is, through Book Talk, the fastest growing of this. So there's this big, especially among millennials and somewhat among Gen Z too, this big disconnect between wanting to read more, but specifically saying that tech is distracting them. So the big challenge for booksellers and publishers is to promote the use of social media as a means of discovery while simultaneously encouraging offline action and kind of bridging that disconnect that currently exists.
Yeah, it's interesting. It sounds like what you're all saying is it's all about sort of, making sure that you get the balance right in terms of these platforms, in terms of how they impact behavior rather than just suck up your time. And you're also kind of thinking though about that hyper fatigue, this whole idea, we started off talking also about how being lurching from crisis to crisis, and of course, this is how a lot of people are getting their news, obviously getting it online, getting it through social media. I mean, you get drawn to these platforms to stay up to date with the news. And as we lurch from crisis to crisis, it seems like there's more of that than ever.
Yeah, and I think how we get news is a big driver of this fatigue. And in many ways, I think, we talk about going from crisis to crisis, and yes, it does feel like that very much at the moment. Some of the crises we've been through are huge, but in some ways it's also just the level of awareness of all these crises, because technology makes us so aware of everything that is going on all the time, everywhere. There are some big things which have been quite unique in the last few years, but then there's also just this constant supply of information about everything, and that's the nature of technology, that you can access bad things going on anywhere in the world anytime that you just wouldn't have heard about 10 years ago. Yeah. And that all compounds to make everything more challenging for consumers, that they're constantly being aware of all these things. And so I think, going back to in terms of how you use technology, it's also just about kind of segmenting it. And I think for brands, it's about creating kind of safe space that gives people time and space to kind of break away from that, perhaps, and obviously with My Travel, I think is a prime example of that, where it's, brands can give people it's escapism in many ways. You want to give people that space to get away from the worries of the world.
Sorry, and then you kind of throw into the mix, not only are people getting all of this information, but now there's the extra step of verifying the information, because there are so many bad actors out there that are providing incomplete or outright misinformation, that now if you hear about something, a lot of people have that instinct, well, now I have to verify this. What's the source? What's this source say about other things? Are they even a legitimate source? And it can short circuit people into just checking out, or it can lead them down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theory, or just find what's accurate, but they come out really tired, really fatigued after it. So, it really underscores the need for trust. And, especially on the brand side, as this sort of specter of mistrust is permeating throughout the kind of theme that we're going for. Trust is really an important part to get consumers on board.
I feel fatigued just tackling this topic.
I guess the flip side to your point, Mike, is that I guess people are very they do scrutinize, and they're very critical now of various different tech platforms or solutions or products or brands themselves, and they want to know the real value of what they're getting. And I think when they get that, I think that removes a sense of fatigue, because now they have the right information and they're their own sort of monitor, I guess. And I think having that knowledge is very empowering. And it definitely helps to kind of offset that level of fatigue almost.
Yeah, I would jump in and say I completely agree. I think one of the most exhausting things for consumers is that trust of knowing who to trust and why to trust. And actually for brands, there's a huge opportunity there. So if you have a trusted brand, then like you say, you can shortcut that and enter into that space. If you've got, even if it's a retailer, so I'm thinking, in the UK, so you've got someone like John Lewis who you would trust, who's got high levels of trust in the UK. And if they launch something, they did a game, sort of like entered a game in, I think it was Roblox, they did it. And, they can enter into these spaces and you can have more trust that it's a brand name that you trust, which is creating an experience or something that's going on. And that's kind of easier than then having to assess and look for sources and decide whether it's something or not you think you trust. You believe in them to look after your data or to protect you from sort of bad actors online and things like that. And brands can leverage that into digital spaces, into digital experiences.
Okay, I mean, what we do, obviously, when we develop these global consumer trends at Mintel, of course, is we have this framework of hyperfatigue, and then to sort of apply it and think about it through different categories, different industries. Let's drill down further then on two categories specifically that will be directly impacted by this trend, hyperfatigue, technology and travel. How do you think hyperfatigue will play out in your respective categories?
So I think in technology, there's different aspects to this. So for online platforms, particularly with the social media platforms, we see an increasing number of kind of self-control options, so people can track how long they're spending online. And we're seeing more platforms take an awareness that this is important to consumers, that they shouldn't just suck them down into a rabbit hole. And pretty much all of the social media platforms now offer some kind of some method of tracking how long you spend on these platforms and reducing it if you need to. Most phones do a similar thing. So I think Apple and Android both have features which allow you to track that. And so this ability to track and control how much you're using technology is becoming more common. And I think will continue to be so. The other aspect of technology that we haven't really talked about yet is around wearables. So wearables are becoming far more popular as time. It's driven primarily at the moment by smart watches. So I think about a fifth of people in the UK now have some kind of smartwatch. And this obviously gives you the ability to track exercise, track your heart rates, and increasingly they can track all sorts of different things, including your stress levels. And then can then use that to give you kind of personalized recommendations to go and take more exercise, or it can assess your sleep and give you tips to sleep better. It can do things like mixing the two from what I said before, and it can recommend that you don't look at your phone or go on TikTok, in the hour before you go to bed, which is probably a good advice for people getting better sleep. And so I think these kind of using technology to regulate your access to technology is a slightly circular thing, but it's something we're increasingly seeing, and I think is going to continue to grow in the next few years. And there's also huge opportunities in new spaces for technology, particularly around things like virtual reality and accessing services, particularly for sort of health and counselling, which would be very hard to access in the physical world or expensive to access, and you can enter into them online or in let's say in immersive kind of digital spaces that you can access these services and protect you and look after your sort of personal well-being. So there's quite a lot going on in tech, and it's only going to grow in the next few years.
So Tom, would you say that wearables in particular, are they a symptom of the trend or a solution to the or an antidote to this trend?
As with everything in technology, I'd say it's both. It can go either way, and it depends how you use it. So the challenge with wearables is that it can help you assess your fitness, and so people use it brilliantly to track their fitness and their health and that sort of thing. But at the same time, one of the main reasons people don't buy fitness trackers is because they think it's stressful to see to see these alerts. It's very stressful having alerts constantly pinging up and saying, when I first got my smartwatch, which is quite old now, but when I first got it, and it had all these alerts which tell you if you've been sat down for 15 minutes, it just keeps buzzing on you to get moving, which is very annoying when you've been sat in a meeting for 15 minutes and it just says, get moving. And well, I can't, I'm in a meeting. So it can be, and that's the other thing, seeing how stressed you are can be stressful.
Yes. Yes.
So all of these things can go either way. It depends how you use it. And as consumers, technology for most of us is still kind of fairly new, and it's evolving so fast that we need tips and support and advice on kind of how to use it and how much time to spend on it. And sometimes these things are helpful, and sometimes they're not so helpful, even if they're well-meaning. I mean, in the financial services space, there's obviously been a big trend towards kind of tracking your finances, which you'll probably know, Andrew, and being able to manage your spending. Sometimes that's really good to see everything you've spent money on, but I think sometimes it's also really stressful, and it can make you spend even more if you can see constantly everything you're doing. So all of these things can kind of go different ways. Some things work for some people, some things don't, and so there's probably going to be a greater kind of personalization as well over time as people realize what works for them and what doesn't.
So that's why I don't have a scale in my house, is because I don't need to see exactly how much I've let myself go during the pandemic.
Exactly.
I was going to say that obviously those wearables will be, probably a popular gift this Christmas, this holiday season, which is my sort of segue into travel. Of course, people are going to be getting into, obviously, on the road, in the air, flying and traveling over the holiday season. How do you think this really applies to travel, Mike?
So it applies in a couple of ways. I think the most acute ramification that we're seeing as it relates to hyperfatigue is this idea of, well, first there's the continuation of this sort of choice paralysis that we're seeing on the research and booking side. This was a growing concern in the industry as more information was put out online at the turn of the century, and people had this question of, well, do we even need travel agents anymore if people can research and book on their own? And to a degree, especially then the young generation millennials were saying, yeah, I can do this all on my own. But now that everyone has put their information out, there's an overwhelming amount of it. And now we're seeing a return to wanting travel advisors to help make the best choices and kind of filter out the 99% of the information that isn't relevant to you and you don't want to know. I think compounding this out of the pandemic are the fact that one of the biggest, if not the biggest, motivation for travel is relaxation. Over about 60% say this is motivation in the coming months for their travel. But what I found really interesting in some of the data that we've got coming back, looking forward into travel in 2023, is how important that having quote unquote the best vacation you can is. So I believe that travelers especially are putting a lot of pressure on themselves to make travel worthwhile, especially coming out of lockdowns over the past couple of years, especially given inflation increasing prices for everything. Immediately after vaccines became widely available, airfares was one of the biggest areas of inflation in the U.S. And just sort of this overall idea of, well, and not only that, but inflation limiting the amount of travel people are doing. People are also saying that they're more likely than anything to take fewer trips in a year directly because of inflation. So you have people taking fewer trips, putting the pressure on them to make them as good as they can, and trying to filter through all of the information. It's really making it important for things like travel advisors to help out, booking brands to make the process seamless and more relevant. And then on the ground, it's up to the staff, airline staff, hotel staff, to really help out travelers and make their visit the best that they can, with the pressure there being a labor shortage on that side. So it's a really interesting, a lot of pressures running against each other in travel right now, in what are increasing stakes for the consumer and for the brand as well.
I think it's really interesting because maybe this stems from being isolated for so long due to the pandemic, but as you say, there's this sort of increased pressure to make sure that experiences deliver for consumers, and they want things to be perfect. But I think that using tech and using those platforms to make sure everything is absolutely perfect on their trip, I think it takes away from the sense of spontaneity, which is one of the reasons why people like to travel in the first place. And I think that's something that I'm personally looking to do. Like, I remember talking to my friends over the weekend, and we were planning a trip for next year. And I said, one of the things I want to do is just to not have an itinerary. I don't want anything planned, because everything has become quite routine for many of us here. And I think tech does definitely play into that. So this is definitely something for brands to consider, for sure.
Where are you going to go?
I think we mentioned Italy. I think Italy's definitely on the list.
So you're not going to just show up at the airport and I heard that is a trend. But obviously, if travel as a whole, kind kind of almost like regardless if you do it, how you do it, if travel as a whole is partly an antidote to this hyper fatigue. Of course, we are, I just saw a headline this morning that Delta expects its earnings to double in 2023. I saw a quote from the CEO of Airbnb who said that he thinks we're entering this sort of golden age of travel. So, perhaps travel obviously is obviously part of the solution to this. All right, so let's just sort of quickly just think then through about how, how long term is this trend? Are we going to see this playing out beyond 2023? How enduring is that?
I mean, I jump in and I say I think it's an enduring trend. I think, as we mentioned, this experience of kind of crises, whether they are actually more frequent or whether your just experience of them is more frequent because we have so much more access to information, is not something that is going to change. And consumers are going to have, to deal with this massive increase in information. And for me, moving forward, Mike touched on it earlier about the importance of curation. People are now so overwhelmed with information on everything from travel to what books to read to what music to listen to or podcasts. There's so much of everything, and particularly with a lot of the online retailers as well, they kind of became popular because they just had so much available to choose from. And increasingly what you're starting to see is a return to in some ways old-fashioned curation, where you just want someone who knows what they're talking about to give you a smaller selection to choose from, and whether that be travel agents in travel, whether that be some of the more traditional retailers online using their skills, their more traditional skills in retailing effectively, to put together a smaller selection of things to choose from, and whether that be Spotify choosing and personalized playlist based on your mood. There's lots of things that brands in different areas can do in order to just make life that little bit easier for people to take that pressure of that choice paralysis when they're looking for what to do. So they want to feel spontaneous. They don't want to feel like they're being pressured into doing anything, but at the same time, you want to kind of be guided through that process so it's not quite as stressful. So I think personally, I think this is a long-term trend, and I think brands will always, probably should have done for a long time, and will continue to consider the importance of consumers' well-being and their mental health in the sort of propositions they're developing, whether that be retail stores, whether that be holidays, whether that be platforms for music or social media or anything. Considering the impact this can have on mental health and well-being, and look for ways to support people to overcome that.
Do you both agree? Do you think we'll still be talking about hyper fatigue this time next year?
I think I agree to an extent. I think that because we have used tech for quite some time, it's not something that we can remove ourselves from. But just knowing and seeing the functional benefits and seeing tech as a functional asset, I feel will help to, I guess, help us navigate that tool a bit more. I think that as Tom said, there's just so much information out there. I'm just wondering, like, from a brand's perspective and from a consumer's perspective, this is probably one of the reasons why they're so receptive to like limited edition offers, for example. Sometimes you see sort of retailers or even restaurants introducing like concepts just for a short period of time, and there's a lot of demand for it, but it just sort of narrows down like your options a little bit more, and just having something available constantly can sort of further sort of exacerbate that pressure, I guess, to constantly opt for it.
I think it's, as far as travel goes, we'll be thinking about this for a long time, not necessarily from the technology aspect, but more from what you said earlier, Andrew, about permacrisis. So right now, we're dealing with, of course, the invasion of Ukraine, which for travel is closing off large areas, Eastern Europe to tourists, but is also diverting flights and making them more expensive as airspace is blocked off over these countries that are involved. But then you have the sort of rise of being more conscious about your travel decisions. And with one of the big sort of storylines of the World Cup being the ethical implications behind the development of the stadiums in Qatar and how the government conducts its policies and how it wants to sort of strengthen its bona fides in the region. I think more Western tourists are going to start questioning going to the area, or even going through that area, as Qatar and some of the other Middle Eastern airlines. That's a big waypoint to get to Asia. And then, of course, we have the ever-present climate crisis. And as we've seen, there's been a growing concern about sustainability. Travel is a huge area of both responsibility and improvement. Airlines are responsible for 3% of global emissions. And they've probably got the toughest road ahead of them as far as becoming carbon neutral. So we're seeing reactions to flying, mostly in Europe, with this idea of Flygskam, or flight shaming, where people are feeling shame or shaming others for taking a flight where they could have taken a train. It's not so much here in the States, as we don't have as robust of a train system. But even these ideas of, do I want to take a more sustainable option? Do I even know what a more sustainable option is? That's a huge area. And then, of course, just climate change affecting destinations. How soon are some of these destinations going to be barred because they need to be preserved, or disappear because of rising tides or coral bleaching, or the Everglades turning over to salt water, and how will that affect the movement of tourists who wanted to go there and now have to go somewhere else. Now those areas are being overcrowded. So we've got a lot of these compounding factors in travel that we have to think about, and there's no one solution because there's no one problem. And for consumers, this is going to be sort of a crisis of conscience as much as it is a climate crisis. And I think that in a lot of ways, you'll start seeing that reflected in the price increases for travel. And then, of course, all of the knock-on effects for consumers that happens.
It's interesting from the travel perspective, the technology I've seen recently. Obviously, Google Maps has added a feature whereby you can, if you search, if you want to go somewhere, travel to somewhere, it will give you the option, not just the fastest option, but the most environmentally friendly options as well. I've noticed it started adding, and so it says, you could obviously you could say, oh, there's a train, or you could cycle this trip, or it will say you could drive this route, which will use up less fuel because it's I don't know, you not a stop or whatever. It's quite interesting feature. And they've also added, I noticed that when you search for hotels, it will tell you which ones are environmentally friendly or not. So all of these things, technology is starting to provide solutions to help people navigate these really difficult conundrums of actually just knowing what are the best options and giving that information out there.
And we are seeing that people are inclined to pay some degree more for a more sustainable option when there are two options that are otherwise identical. Like Google Flights saying, oh, this flight will use 20% fewer emissions than a flight normally on this route, or 5% more, so to kind of help educate and inform travelers, which is a huge starting point in the industry, is even just informing what sustainable travel is, what goes into it, how to be more sustainable when traveling.
And that transparency is really important, and it has a direct impact on the decisions they make. So yeah, I completely agree.
All right. So, I mean, throughout our conversation, we've sort of talked a bit about some implications for brands, but perhaps, I could ask you to sort of, what piece of advice would you give a brand looking to navigate this hyper fatigue trend?
Tom, you mentioned earlier that Apple and Android give you the options to limit your use or keep and monitor your use of apps, or how much you're using your phone. And I think that's a really good way. That's a good place to start. And I think that even that can be further personalized. You can track sort of who you're even speaking to, or you can set timers on very specific apps, whether it's a gaming app or a social networking platform. So that would be, I think that will continue to be really useful for people moving forward. I think at the moment, a lot of us are in that space where, we're wanting to save. As we've already said, inflation is continuing to put pressure on all of us, and any opportunities via tech or otherwise to save money will be very popular. I think there was one app a friend of mine recommended to me actually recently. It's called Airtime Rewards, and I think you're able to sort of get cash back and rewards through Boots or Greggs or Wilko's when you make purchases there, and then that money then goes towards paying your phone bill. So I think a lot of consumers will find that really useful. It's a really great opportunity to kind of cover your costs. And I think it really will empower people as well. I think people want to have more money available at the end of the month to be able to spend on experiences, on their interests. They want to go to the theatre, they want to go on holiday, they want to go and see people. They want to, they really want to indulge. They want to go to restaurants. They do want to spend. It's not all about saving constantly. And, especially the younger consumers who we often refer to as the most adventurous age group. But we often refer to them in the sense where it's they're constantly looking for sort of experiences, entertainment. But they're adventurous in the sense where, they're really starting to think about their future as well. And they want to save for that. And I think this is a really good opportunity actually for, fintech, finance companies, even mortgage companies to even think about how they can help younger people. I think they're really starting to take risks. There's a lot of us who are, buying our first property. They're, taking investment risks. They're starting a business. They're really starting to see the benefits of how this can help shape their future. And I think that will really help. I think brands should definitely take that into account, because this is how they can kind of steer consumers from feeling financially or otherwise fatigued to feeling financially empowered.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think I think the main thing is it's just really important for brands to just consider what it is that they're asking consumers to do when they, perhaps with a marketing campaign or with a project. There's always so much demand, particularly online, for people to just spend as much time as possible. So the metric that you measure is just eyeball time. How much of people's time can you get them to spend looking or interacting with your brand? But actually, can you do that more productively? We've seen already that actually too much eyeball time can actually be negative. People can come away from that experience kind of resenting it. I could spend absolutely ages going down a TikTok rabbit hole or a rabbit hole on Reddit, and I may spend absolutely ages on it, but then I come away thinking I need to delete TikTok because otherwise I'm just never going to get anything else done. So actually, how can that experience be productive and have something that you take away and make sure that time is actually kind of is beneficial to them and that they're going to think back on it positively? And the other thing that we haven't entirely touched on, we talked about in a previous podcast, Andrew, is the future of the kind of metaverse, and not just whether or not you believe as a metaverse as a topic put to the side, but the technology, which there's so much investment into technologies related to it that it's going to kind of change the way that people interact with the internet and online spaces. And so it's going to become increasingly important for brands to think about how people are spending time in their sort of digital brand experience, whether that be a digital shop or a digital space or an event, and making sure that the well-being of those consumers is taken into account in that process. Because we've seen so many times that technology can easily end up being what could be positive, could end up becoming a negative. And it's just something that always needs to be front of mind, I think, when you're developing any kind of brand experience moving forward, especially in new digital spaces and new digital experiences.
I think for travel brands in particular, it's about striking this balance between maximizing the utility of technology and minimizing the reliance on technology. So being able to use things like algorithmic learning to surface the most compelling and the most relevant search options for someone booking travel, but then giving them an itinerary or helping them create an itinerary that if they want to be disconnected from tech, which is something that we're seeing is a big sort of feature in destinations, more remote, less connected areas, is making them feel secure in where they are, and that they can kind of make them remember that they can get around without the use of a smart device all the time. They can use a map and ask directions. So having that, so sort of using tech to make them confident that they're getting there, and then once they're there, make sure that they're confident that they can get back without it.
Great. All right. Well, last question for you. Obviously, the holidays are upon us. Do you have any tips to help listeners to navigate hyperfatigue during the holiday season and coming into the new year?
I think from my perspective, I was going to give one tip, particularly from a technology perspective, for the Christmas period and generally, it would be to turn off as many notifications on your phone as you can.
Yeah.
I think
agree with
notifications are one of the most stress-inducing things, even if they're mundane and irrelevant. So many apps are constantly pinging you on your phone. So go through the apps list and turn off notifications for absolutely everything unless it's absolutely essential. And even those ones that are, put them on silent. You should access technology on your own terms, not get sucked into it when you don't want to. That would be my tip.
Yeah, for travel, I'd say statistically, if you've booked a trip, you've already booked it. So you're locked into your plans. I would say that remember that the people that are working at your travel brands, your airlines, your hotels, they're probably short-staffed. They aren't happy that your flight's been delayed either. Just try to be patient and nice with them. That's probably the best thing you can do. We also know statistically that if you are stressed out, you are going to hate everything at the airport. So do yourself a favor and don't try not to get too worked up.
I know I said before that with TikTok, for example, that like following video tutorials and videos on how to cook, for example, is very popular. But I think one piece of advice I'd give is to actually try cooking something without looking at anything. Just have a go at making something new without looking at tech or apps or social media, and just make lots of errors in the kitchen and fall flat on your face. I think that's the best way of sometimes it's nice. I think it's refreshing. You actually learn a lot from your mistakes. And I think it's nice to kind of steer away from this idea of being perfect as well, which sometimes we can fall into when we overuse tech. So yeah, give it a go, see what happens.
Excellent. Well, I love it. These are all great tips. I'd throw one in there: stretch more. I was like, again, using technology, Instagram, saw this exercise about stretching my back. Oh, yes. All right. Well, this has been a great end of season holiday conversation. Really lots to digest and to unpack. I think sort of three kind of big takeaways for me. I think it comes down to understanding how consumers are feeling. A lot of these trends that we put together at Mintel, it's all about what motivates them, what their aspirations are, because that unlocks opportunities for brands in way, shows them how they can support consumers, how they can help consumers. I think one of the kind of key themes sort of that kept coming back through these conversations. The conversation today was around making digital interactions much more intentional, not just noise. I think, Mike, you talked about striking the balance, and that's important. You all stressed how important these digital tools are and how helpful they can be, but it's like when you mentioned the banking apps. Some of them just get overloaded with like meaningless digital features. You want something intentional that's actually going to help you in your life. And then finally, I think consumers are clearly seeking and will value meaningful, authentic experiences as the antidote to hyperfatigue. And of course, that sets the stage nicely for things like the travel industry going into 2023. So, all right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Namada. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you want to know more about Mintel, who we are and what we do, head over to mintel.com. Check out our blog for even more insights from our analysts, and sign up to become a member of the free Mintel Spotlight community. Good news, we'll be back next year for a new season. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Wish you a happy holidays and a wonderful new year. Goodbye for now, and we'll catch you in 2023 for season 5 of the Mintel Little Conversation.